Let's get this started. Welcome, everyone. This is webinar number 10. I can't believe it's been 10 weeks already. This has kind of flown by. So this is the wrap-up webinar. We're going to be going through a few things, but going to keep it light, going to keep it fun, and we'll do some soundscapes kind of at the end as well. I am coming at you today from Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. And it just happens to be, in my estimation, quite a beautiful city. So if you're ever passing through the area, come check out Saskatoon. We've got a nice river running through it. It's pretty gorgeous. My name, of course, is Leanne, and I don't think there's anybody new who signed up quite so last minute, but there's a few people that haven't signed up for a ton of them. So again, my name is Leanne Lachemoy, and I have the great pleasure of working for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a national not-for-profit. We do all kinds of work, from everything from bird science, outreach, education, citizen science, and two of my favorite things are kind of outreach and education and wetlands. And it's been a ton of fun to be able to put those two things together and deliver this kind of programming. So I count myself, super fortunate to be able to do this. And I can still do them with a bum knee. Pretty great. Some of the Zoom era is kind of useful in that regard. Okay, on the agenda for this evening, we'll just do a quick overview, kind of the high points of why wetlands are important. We're going to review the wetland plants because we didn't get to do that last week, thankfully, because it already took 2 hours just doing the birds and frogs. We're going to listen to some wetland soundscapes, just a quick overview of how to collect a checklist if you want to collect data for citizen science. And I'm going to give you a few stats about, MarshWatch and, how many people have tuned in and all of that kind of good stuff. And then we can just open it up to discussion. Don't have a quiz this evening, but there's all kinds of quizzes that are still up on the website, and some of them are kind of larger review quizzes. So feel free to check them out. I haven't updated them. I'm hoping maybe next year I'll have a bit more time to update the quizzes and kind of refresh them, because otherwise you're doing the same quiz over and over. I don't have a great quiz software platform, so I'm kind of stuck with whatever I can manage through creative use of Google Forms. Okie doke. So what on earth is a wetland? Well, wetland is really a transition habitat between, a wet system, like a fully aquatic system like a lake, and dry land. A wetland really is that kind of wet interface. The plants in there, they're adapted to, varying levels of, flooding and drought. They also have to be resilient, especially the ones that are kind of on the margins of wetland, especially, in a system like the prairies, where we do have such dramatic fluctuations, sometimes within a season, but also, between years. And as a lot of us are familiar with, between the kind of longer term drought and deluge cycles, we're still trying to pull out of that drought. The groundwater levels have been depleted for several years, because we're going up with you know quite a few years of pretty solid drought, and it takes a lot of time for any of that groundwater to recharge. So sometimes the first few years after pulling out of a drought, you go, gosh, the wetlands still aren't full, and it's because all that water is just going down and trying to bring up the water level, the water table. So interesting system here on the prairies, and they really, really are a lovely transition ecosystem. Out here on the prairies, wetlands are actually classified based on, their water permanence and vegetation zones. Because it is such a dynamic system here, you know, a wetland can be dry, say, 1 out of every 5 years, or 1 out of every 10, or 1 out of every 20. And that's going to dictate a little bit, what types of vegetation are forming in that wetland. It's also going to help to renew them. As the water level dries down, there's some of the plants on the margin that are going to, die out because it's suddenly way too dry for them. And as water levels come back, some of those plants will come back, and it really does help to refresh and renew the system. So as much as it is very shocking and sad, I don't like seeing dry wetlands, at least the ones that, are naturally going dry. It's not always a pleasant thing to see, but it is part of the natural cycle, and it does help to keep the wetland habitats healthy. Oh, we've got to keep clicking on the screen. There we go. And then, just as I mentioned, so There is a whole system that was developed by Stewart and Cantrud in the 70s, and it kind of just, looks a little bit like this. Class one wetlands are essentially just low prairie zones. Imagine if there was no farmland and it was just prairies, all of those kind of just wet areas that have slightly lusher grasses in them. Those are ephemeral wetlands, and they really only hold water for a couple of weeks in the spring before the frost plug melts, and then, the rest of the water goes all the way through. Then you have wet meadows. Those are, where you start to find some of your mints. You'll maybe get a little bit of sedges and rushes and spike rushes. Shallow wetlands, you start to get more and more sedges, water plantain, water smartweed. You're getting, a decent amount of water in those. And then there's semi-permanent wetlands, the deep marshes where you'll often find your cattails and your bulrushes. And then class five wetlands have some amount of open water within them. So you're always classifying it based on essentially the deepest water level zone that you have in a wetland, and you kind of basing it off that plant community as well as the structure. And it looks like this. And you might be wondering, gosh, Leanne, why are there so many wetlands on the prairies? And as we went through in the first one, it all has to do with the Ice Age, and more specifically, the meltdown of the last Ice Age. As the ice sheets retreated, it didn't really happen in any sort of orderly fashion. And if you've ever been, near a big water body that you've seen kind of melting and some of the ice is rotting, or even, in your own backyard, there's places where some of the ice melts faster, some of it, breaks off into chunks. And that's essentially what a lot of these pothole wetlands are on the prairies. As water was, as the ice was melting away, there was kind of chunks of ice that got left behind. And especially, as the water level is high, there's a lot of sediment action and stuff moving. And some of those chunks, they can get a little bit buried. So oftentimes you'll see a shallow depression kind of in and amongst some hills, and that's sediment kind of around where that ice chunk would have been. So these are small, generally unconnected shallow basins, and they typically freeze straight to the bottom in the winter, so they can't actually support fish life, a lot of them. Some of the deeper ones absolutely can, but most of the small ones, unless for whatever reason it's a really strange little one and it's quite small but very, very deep, for the most part they can't support any fish life, and this makes them really, really great habitats, for insect and macroinvertebrate life to flourish, because there's not a ton of predators in the water column. And then, all of that biomass helps to feed a lot of wetland birds, and some of them more directly or indirectly than others. And wetlands, they do really serve a purpose on the landscape. They're not just nice to look at. They don't just, provide me lots of entertainment. They're really great at doing a few things. And some of the keys is essentially acting like a sponge. They do a really good job of absorbing floodwater and recharging groundwater. And this is because if you've ever gone around in a wetland and dug around in the kind of muck and mire in it, you'll realize that a lot of it is just kind of slowly decomposing organic matter. It's a very, very heavily organic soil. A lot of it is fibrous, and all of those plant fibers, they do really act like a sponge. So they're really excellent at absorbing lots of water. Those wetland soils will swell a great deal and hold on to a lot of water. And they also help release water as the rest of the, landscape dries up, as the water table decreases. It does help to slowly recharge the surrounding area. So it helps to keep more moisture in the area. So classic kind of sponge behavior, really good at absorbing, but it also holds on pretty well to a certain amount of water. And as I alluded to, with all of that plant matter and stuff acting like the sponge, they're really good at sequestering carbon. So all of that organic decaying material, that's all carbon that is hanging out in the bottom of that wetland. And they also do a pretty great job of purifying water, again, through some of that sponge action, but also through some of the bioorganic processes that happen, within some of the plants do a good job. A lot of the microinvertebrates, like bacteria and all sorts of things, they all, help to clean up the water column. They're also really good at preventing shoreline erosion. A lot of people don't really like, for whatever reason, to see, wetland margins on nice swimming lakes, but that's what's helping to keep your shoreline intact. If you have a bunch of wetland vegetation, it's going to diffuse that wave action before it hits the shore. So they can be super important for preventing erosion on shorelines. And of course, they're food and essential habitat for an awful lot of animals, like we've covered in this series, but also they're important food resources for humans. Wild rice, while it doesn't grow in the southern prairies, it's in the northern boreal forest, but it's still a wetland habitat, and the wild rice is really an important food source. Cranberries like to grow in wetlands. You know, fish, game, assorted plant roots. If you're out hunting in the fall season, like a lot of those wetlands are good areas to hunt because there's lots of vegetation for critters to get around and eat in. So wetlands are super important. And here's just a couple of photos of things that you might not think of as a food source for larger birds. So, those tiny, tiny little midges that hatch in the springtime, and you'll see these great columns, and it looks almost like smoke. Those are usually large midge hatches. They're non-biting, they're pretty innocuous. Sometimes they can pile up in great, great numbers. I've seen them like 2 inches thick on a cabin before. It's amazing the amount of biomass that is produced. And all of that biomass really does help to feed a lot of critters, and even things like this Franklin's gull. We're thinking, oh, gosh, that's kind of a big bird, and I didn't think it would go after a small midge. They do, and these wetlands really do provide a lot of, um, you know, food in big bursts. Like the midge hatches, there is a lot of food available, and so this little duckling has to work for it, but because there is so much of that biomass that's produced, the duckling doesn't have to work like crazy to get all of its food. So it's, eating midges, it's eating plants. It definitely needs the protein, to grow into a big adult duck. But I just thought those were some pretty adorable pictures of ducks chasing itty bitty little midges. Okay. Now I've talked about a little bit about why wetlands are important and cool and wonderful. Let's quickly review some of the common wetland plants. So I did see a question coming up in the chat, and the question is, why can't we include plants in our report for the checklists? And it was a bit of a balance because this isn't necessarily a plant survey. It's more, trying to get information about birds and amphibians. We also wanted to keep it simple because there's an awful lot of plants that we cover very generally, and doing a plant inventory is something that's a little bit more in depth. But if ever you want to write those into the comments, feel free to describe the wetland in the comments for sure. Okay, as I mentioned before, wetlands are, areas that have plants that are adapted to live in these wet environments. They're tolerant to flooding to varying degrees, and also some of them are more or less tolerant to drying. And they're quite lush. Wetlands really are productive places for plants as well. So first up, let's cover cattails. And a few webinars ago, somebody rightfully pointed out, like, hey, Leanne, I know there's a few species of cattail. What's up? And we will cover them today. But first, generally speaking, let's look at cattails kind of as a broader group. So cattails are wetland plants that, have flattened leaves and stems. They're generally bright green in color, and there's many leaves that grow from the base. And these can be quite tall. Some of them, 4 to 5 feet, all the way up to 10 feet tall. They can be quite tall. Like my friend Mike in the bottom left corner here, we were doing some plant surveys in a wetland, and it was tough to measure the full length of the cattail that was sticking up out of the water. So there's quite a bit of variability depending on the habitat that the cattail is finding itself in. The flowers, essentially, it looks like a corn dog on a stick. So the bottom parts are nice and brown in the early season, and those are the male flowers, and eventually those will release just inordinate amounts of pollen. You can actually collect that pollen and bake with it. I've never done that, but I have been coated in a fair bit of cattail pollen in my life. And the female flowers are on top in a little bit of a spike, and those are some of the things that you'll see kind of in the later season as the plants come into making seeds. You'll see little wrens and things grabbing the tiny, teeny tiny little seeds on them. So you'll find cattails in both deep and shallow water. They can be tolerant to a degree of drying, so they won't immediately die, say if a wetland draws down for maybe a season, maybe two. They will eventually, die out if they're really, not getting that water input that they want. But Cattails are interesting because they also can form floating mats, which can be rather terrifying if you're out walking in a wetland. So they I don't know exactly how it starts, but sometimes you can get entire islands that form of cattail mats. And I've stood on one that had trees growing on it, but it was a floating cattail wetland. And depending on the wind, one portion of that pond was accessible, and if it was another wind direction, you could only access another portion of the pond. So kind of an interesting characteristics. There's other species that'll sometimes form mats as well. I've seen sedge mats. Some of them in the boreal forest can be also quite terrifying because you're walking along and all of a sudden you notice that the spruce trees are kind of tilting inwards at you as you step, and you go, oh, there's water below me. Great. It's a little bit terrifying, but neat little feature. So let's get into the different cattail species. The native cattail species is Typha latifolia, and this one has the male and female flowers quite smooshed together. There's no gap in between those two. Typha angustifolia is presumed to be native to Europe. I know there has been some discussion in the literature whether that's actually true or not, but it mostly appears that way, and I think that's kind of the general consensus. It is native to Europe, but it has come over to North America. Not sure how the spread happened, but we're great at moving around things along with our, people and agriculture. So the difference here is there isn't the leaf is narrower, but there's a big gap between the two portions of the flower stalk. So there's a big kind of corn dog on a stick, a green stem, and then you'll get those female flowers pointing out at the top there. And interestingly, the two species are really well known for forming a hybrid, and that's the hybrid Typha glauca. So it's some mixture of Typha latifolia and Typha angustifolia, and there can be all kinds of back crosses. So it shows kind of intermediate characteristics of the two. There is usually some gap between the two portions of the flower stalk, but that can be quite variable. But in the native species, they're smooshed together. There's no gap. In the angustifolia, there's quite a bit of one, and in the hybrid species, the Typha glauca, there is kind of an intermediate gap. The Typha latifolia, the native species, has quite a broad leaf, and the Typha angustifolia has quite a narrow leaf. And again, the hybrid shows somewhat of an intermediate group between the two. Interestingly, one of the papers that I took a quick peek at when I was looking at this was trying to figure out what the distribution was of, the hybrid species and the two full species. And as it turns out, the hybrid species is doing really, really well. And that could be a good thing or that could be a bad thing. In some wetlands, it was mostly the hybrid species that had completely taken over. So I haven't done the full deep dive and looking, totally throughout the literature, but there is two species as well as a sneaky hybrid, and you can tell them apart, but apparently the hybrid is becoming one of the most commonly encountered of the three varieties, if you want to call them that. Someone's asking if the hybrid is more red, and I think that might just be the photo. I think you're looking more at the morphological characteristics and not quite so much the color. But interesting, biological things happening there where, you get that hybrid vigor, and the hybrid is really, really good. And, yes, this was likely a human introduced thing, but, species have been coming together and going apart, for millennia. So it's always interesting when we can see this sort of thing happen. And, maybe we don't necessarily think it's the best, but I'm not sure if, the invasive species is necessarily super detrimental, considering it is very, very similar in, form and function to the native species. So I'll leave you to do your own deep dive reading if you're super interested in that. But that's the kind of Cole's notes of what I know. Okay. Another species that is often found in deeper water are bulrushes. These are dark green, They're round in circumference, so they have a single spiked stalk. There's kind of just one little leafy thing going on, quite round and very spongy in the center. You know, you depending on the subspecies, they can be quite rigid or they can be, quite malleable, but there is a spongy center. So if you grab one and pick it in half, you can see all of those kind of spongy tissues on the inside of it. And these can be quite tall, anywhere from kind of 3 to 10 feet-ish. The flowers form neat little tassels that hang off the top, not quite at the end of the spike, but near the end of the spike. And marsh wrens, they really do seem to. I think this is a sedge wren. It is a sedge wren. Anyway, marsh wrens and sedge wrens both really like it for perching because it provides a nice, easily gripped stalk. So you'll often see them hanging out on them. They do form dense monoculture stands, so oftentimes you can see the difference, especially at a distance in coloration. The really dark green stuff is going to be your bulrushes, and the lighter green stuff is going to be your cattails. So they're a really neat species, and hopefully you can get out to a wetland and check some of them out. There's also, this is another one that has a native and an invasive counterpart that are really, really similar. The native one is the common reed, Phragmites australis, and it is, they're very pretty plants. It is a grass. They have bright green leaves when they're fresh, and these can be very tall. They can get up to 20 feet in height. And I have walked through dense stands of the invasive species, and it's kind of eerie because it is so tall and so dense that it was its own humid habitat within the reed bed. So I don't necessarily recommend it as the most pleasant walking, but they can form incredibly dense mats. They kind of look like bamboo. They do have a hollow stem, and they have kind of a feathery flower tip at the end. So you see the leaves coming off the stem, and at the very top, the center of the stem, there's a kind of a plume-like flower at the very top there. You'll find them in wetlands. They often colonize ditches. They can be salt tolerant, and they also form large monoculture stands. The European subspecies does really, really, really well in those conditions, and it often outcompetes a lot of other native species. So, especially if you're back east, I would always see this quite regularly as you're driving down any sort of highway or anything. There's oftentimes Phragmites in the ditch, and it's because they're great at being salt tolerant, and they're super super tolerant to like flood and drought. So they're really great at doing what they do. It's just that the invasive one is really really good, and doesn't quite have the natural checks and balances on it. So the invasive Phragmites looks very very similar. That's it in the fall. In the springtime, it looks much like the other one. And the differences between the two are not always easy to tell, and they are quite subtle. And some of them involve, measuring tiny flower parts and looking through a hand lens. So it can be tough. I just generally call them all Phragmites. It is tough to get down to species. In the fall, apparently the invasive species stays greener longer. And, the native species, the stem tends to turn a reddish purple in the fall. And I have actually seen this, and it is quite beautiful when you see them in the fall, the native species. So sadly enough, it's one of those things that can be tough to tell, during the height of the growing season. But in fall, that purplish stem can be a nice dead giveaway. Apparently, the middle leaf on the Phragmites has a little structure. If you know your grass plant anatomy at all, this is the ligule. So there's a leaf sheath, and then what we think of as the leaf coming off of that. And that kind of that interface, there is just a little bit of plant tissue that sticks up, and that's called the ligule. And it is very, very small in both of them, but it is slightly longer in the native species. But again, you're trying to measure below a millimeter in length. So tough to tell. And again, there's flower parts that you can take a look at, but again, it is really quite difficult to tell the two apart. But just do know that we do have a native subspecies. Oh yeah, there's a nice picture of it in the fall, but that nice kind of purpley-ish or reddish looking stem. So it does stand out, and that is kind of helpful. Okay, duckweed is probably one of my favorites. It is an absolutely teeny tiny little plant. They tend to have kind of 2 or 3 leaves, and they're floating species. Some of them some of them seem to be a little bit more semi-submerged, like the Lemna tricelca down here. That's a species that has kind of few more offshoots on it, and it forms less of a carpet. The duckweed is really like totally wall-to-wall coverage of a carpet, and the Lemna tricelca just kind of forms these dense kind of hairy clusters almost. They're neat little plants. They have little rootlets that hang down and they just kind of chill out on the water surface. And indeed, they are really nutritious, and a lot of ducks, especially the dabbling species, definitely eat a whole lot of duckweed. The flowers are, tiny and essentially not visible. And you'll find duckweed mostly in kind of still water. So within some of those wetlands that are small and they have a little bit of open water, sometimes you'll get a lot of duckweed on it, or in kind of quieter areas of a larger wetland system. Carex sedges, these look like grasses, but the thing to remember is sedges have edges. So the leaves are quite kind of jagged in cross section. If you were to like snip a leaf down, across across the leaf, you would see it's almost like a little W. So they have quite jagged, firm little edges along the leaves, and the leaves are kind of rough, but they do definitely look grass-like, and you could totally be forgiven for thinking that's a grass because it certainly does look like one. They tend to have a triangular stem for the most part, and they're not very tall, about 1 to 3 feet. The carex sedges in particular form a cute little nutlet. There's a nutlet inside this little puffy sac here, and this is also the flower, coming out the very, very tip of it. You'll find these in shallow water to kind of wet meadow situations. So sometimes on a bigger wetland, if the slope is nice and gentle, you'll get bands of different habitats, and you'll see the carex sedges kind of, they like it moist but not not super dry. I have seen them in areas where there is quite a bit of water, but they don't go for the really, really deep stuff at all. Rushes are round, so it's kind of the counterpart to sedges have edges. Sedges have edges, and rushes are round. That goes for bulrushes and these little rushes as well. The rushes, the Juncus genus, they tend to be dark green. They're round, they're wiry. They don't have that kind of spongy center. It's a single spiked stalk, and they're generally short, up to about 2 feet. The flowers, though, are really quite beautiful, and in a second here, I'll show you a close-up of them. These guys are often found in moist soil situations, so especially, if you're out on the prairies and you're driving along, just pay attention to the different colors and tones in the ditch next to you. Oftentimes, when you see that really kind of dark, deep green, you're going to have a patch of rushes there. So kind of moist soil areas. They don't like to get their feet too wet. And they do definitely resemble small bulrushes. And I've heard them, colloquially called round grass or wire grass as well. But here's a close-up of those photos. I just think they're one of the more beautiful little subtle wetland flowers that you could possibly see. I really quite like them. Okay, spike rushes, they resemble small spears. So some of them can be round, but some of them can also be a little bit angular. There's one that's called three square. It is some of them are triangular, and I think the three square is probably four-sided. Anyway, they look like teeny tiny little spears. They can be dark green. They have that single spiked stalk, and they can be up to 3 feet, but oftentimes I see them in areas where they're quite a fair bit shorter. Flowers are right here on the tip of the stem, giving it that kind of lance or spear-like shape, and they tend to like shallow water to wet meadows. Very cute little spike rushes. I definitely, I find they bring joy every time I see them. I don't know why I'm strange. I like wetland plants. Okay. I'm going to take one sip of water here, and we'll get to the invasive flowering rush. The flowering rush, while incredibly beautiful, is an invasive species. So if you do see it, it's important to report that sort of thing. And some of the best places to do that, if you have a provincial conservation data center, they'll often take sightings, but a lot of the conservation data centers also use iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is really the place to go to submit your plant observations. Um, more about that a little bit later. So they make these gorgeous pink flowers in a beautiful umbel. So they all kind of meet at the center here, and you get those little flower stalks making just they just really look beautiful. I'm very sad that they're invasive. They have long, kind of pointed leaves up to a meter long that are triangular in cross section. And you'll find them in areas where there's a bit of slow moving water up to about 3 meters deep. I did find some in Saskatchewan along the South Saskatchewan River. They are known in Alberta and another location in Saskatchewan, but they seem to be creeping up the South Saskatchewan River, making their way into the province here. So if you do see them, definitely report invasive species. Purple loosestrife is another one that is really gorgeous. It's too bad that it likes to, take over, form dense stands, but they make beautiful bright purple flowers in these lovely little spikes. They're in the mint family, so if you're familiar with mints at all, they have squared stems and paired leaves. They have smooth edges to the leaves, and the leaves are at right angles to the stems. You'll find them in ditches, wet meadows, marshes, lake edges. Here in Saskatoon, I've been finding them along the river. There's a few little kind of sandbars and rock bars and things, and I've seen a few purple loosestrife there. So if you do see them, it is important to report them. Here's just a close-up of that cross section of the stem. You can sort of see that it's triangular. And again, if you've ever, handled a mint plant, just, think mint has that nice kind of square stem and pairs of leaves coming off the stem. Another one, it's less important here in the province because they can't tolerate the winters, but in other places they can be a problem, is water hyacinth. And they do still sell these at a lot of, garden centers, sometimes even pet shops will have them if they sell plants for aquariums and stuff. And that's all fine if you're keeping them well contained, especially if it's something like an indoor terrarium, fine, just don't dump them outside. And that kind of goes for everything. Don't dump your fish in the wetlands. Don't set them free. It's not good. They don't belong there. Anyway, water hyacinth, they're floating plants. They have green leaves with a large bladder that allows them to float around. They're native to South America, and they can really clog, wetlands, waterways, and really, gum things up. But you can see why people plant them and want to have them in their water gardens and things, because they do have just incredibly beautiful, showy flowers. So gorgeous little plant. But you don't want, something like this invading your pond or your lake and covering all of the surface area, and they just outcompete a lot of the other vegetation. So a lot of things will die under the water, and if you have a large die off, you can create conditions where, that decay is just, generally speaking, bad for the health of the waterway and the other critters that are trying to live in there. Okay, submit your plant photos to iNaturalist. iNaturalist is kind of the best place to submit most things wildlife. eBird still is, or if you're taking part in a Birds Canada program, for sure submit it to Birds Canada as well. But for a lot of frogs, insects, plants, all that sort of thing, iNaturalist is a really, really great place to put them. I'm sure most of you are familiar with collecting some of the stuff, but you record your observation, you share it. It has tools to help you identify things, and then people will weigh in and go, actually, this is a such and such. And then somebody else will weigh in and say, I agree, it is a such and such. So all of the records, do get verified by the community. Okay. I mentioned wetland plants at a distance, and you can do a little bit of this. So in this photo, there's 3 kind of clusters of different species. If you remember, I was talking about how the rushes and the cattails, they like this sort of, fairly deep water and open stuff. So you can see the cattails in the foreground here. I'll just remove it for a sec. You can see the remnants of last year's cattails. These are still young and growing, so they haven't made those little corn dogs on the stick, but you can see, flattened leaves. There's many of them coming from the base, and you can still, see last year's cattail flower stalks sticking up. Those are the cattails. Further back, we've got those dark, dark, dark green bulrushes. If you got closer, you could tell that they were round in cross section, but they generally look like it's just one little leaf coming out in a variety of places. In the foreground here, there's this kind of grassy looking thing, and it is indeed a sedge in that kind of wetlandy area. And that was a shallow spot, lo and behold. It was easy to walk out into this wetland. So you can use them at a distance. And some of that stuff is just useful when you're birding with somebody else, say, over there by the bulrushes, or, same as you would for doing any other birding, it's over there by the pine tree or the spruce tree. Knowing at least a little bit about, the other nature that's around you can still just help. Even if you don't care about plants, that's fine. You don't have to, but it's still useful for, directing someone else's attention to say, hey, over by the bulrushes, there's a coot that's going to pop out in a second here. So can be super useful, even if that's all you do with it. Okay. Now we're going to listen to a few soundscapes. Unfortunately, I haven't had the time to make nearly as many soundscapes as I would have liked. So some of these are repeats from ones that I did last year. So apologies for that, but I will have a few other soundscapes and they're still repeats. I didn't sadly get to make anything new for this one, but first we're just going to listen to this little soundscape, and then I'll play a little bit of an animation that kind of shows some of the species as they're going. So this is recorded in, a wetland that I don't think this was the exact station, but this photo was taken near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan, while we were doing a big project with recorders and wetlands. So we have lots of good recordings from out there. So let's give a listen. And this is June 3rd at 1 a.m. So, quite late, quite the middle of the night, but wetlands really, really come alive at night. It's incredible. If you get the chance to go check out a wetland at night, I recommend doing it. Don't do it yet. It's gonna be a little quiet yet, but like early June is a really great time. Okay, let's listen to this wetland soundscape. Okay, hopefully a lot of those sounds are familiar to you and the sounds coming through not too terribly. Let's go ahead to, next, how do I, next slide? No. Okay, I think this is the next slide. Aha, okay, this is the next slide. I should have labeled them better. Okay, we're gonna have a little couple of birds pop up as they're calling. And one of the things that I recommend, if you're new to going out and listening to bird sound, just kind of sit and immerse yourself in what the soundscape sounds like without worrying about trying to identify things at first. Just kind of get a sense for what's going on around you. And then, if there's something, it's like, oh, there's a lot of this sound. Try to identify that sound first, and then you can sort of get it out of the way. So if there's a few things that are close, I find it's really helpful to just, take mental note. It's like, okay, there is a marsh wren or a sedge wren right near me. It is loud. It is singing lots. Okay, I'm going to listen to it. And then I've kind of mentally acknowledged it. And then you try to listen past it. You don't try to latch on to every time it calls. You're kind of listening through it, if that makes any sense. And that's something that you have to do if you're doing, any sort of point count survey. There's always going to be really common species, especially in a wetland. That's oftentimes it's the blackbirds that are just going nuts all the time. So I just kind of give myself a minute to like, okay, yep, red-winged blackbirds. I'm not going to count them right now, and I'm going to listen through the red-winged blackbirds, and then at the end, I kind of, or at the end of my whatever the time frame is, okay, I've got about 5 of them going. And it's just a little tip for trying to listen through some of the wetland species. Okay, soundscape number 2, a little bit later in the season. This is a nice 4 a.m. recording, so you're likely to hear more other species going on. So let's give that one a listen. There was a lot going on in that one. And the marshman, the cedron is really kind of front and center with that chick, 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 chick. So those couple of intro notes and then that really staccato sewing machine type rattle at the end of it. So let's get to listening to, there we go, with a little bit of animation. So hopefully you've been able to hear a few of these. So quite a bit going on there. Somehow the red-winged blackbird wasn't screaming the whole time, so that was kind of convenient. Some of those sounds, it takes practice to get to listen to, and I think I shared this before. For whatever reason, for me personally, if I'm out there listening to, wetland soundscape, for whatever reason, I tune out common yellowthroat, and so it's a conscious thing for me to have to, okay, I'm near a wetland, like Leanne, is there a common yellowthroat singing? So, if you're out there with people, it can be hard to get your brain used to listening for some sounds, and it can just be tough, and especially those ones that tend to be a bit more quiet. And not everyone's hearing is the same. I've actually got some hearing loss, so I have hearing aids, and it makes my life so much better because it was really frustrating to go out to wetlands or do other bird surveys with people, and there's just certain frequencies that I was not hearing until it got above a certain decibel, and it's like, oh well, yes, there is a very loud blue jay was one of the worst for me. I couldn't hear it until I got to a certain decibel threshold, then my ear picked it up. So you know don't feel bad if you're having a hard time hearing a few things. Everybody's hearing's different, and if you do have the opportunity to, like, notice through birding with other people that, gosh, I'm really not hearing stuff terribly well, this will just be a small PSA for, like, get your hearing checked, and you know maybe if you can go get yourself some hearing aids, because they have made a world of difference for me, like in my personal life, just hearing people, but just being able to hear the birds again is just so magical. So, don't be too embarrassed by it. They make them a lot smaller than they used to. So this is small PSA that, maybe if you're not hearing some of them, you could have some hearing loss that, maybe can be rectified. No shame in that. I mean, a lot of people wear glasses. Same with hearing aids. They're just a different tool to help make up for some personal deficiency, which happens. Okay. Here's another one from a similar sort of area. This one's a little bit earlier in the season, another 4 a.m. track. So let's give a listen and see what we can hear. forgot how long that one was. There is so much going on. So I don't know if you were able to hear it, but one of the species that was up close, there was a marsh wren going, and it's a nice contrast because the last, couple that we've listened to, it's been a sedge wren, and the marsh wren really sometimes sounds like it's taking a deep breath before it goes into its kind of more liquidy sounding rattle. So kind of really does kind of have a little bit of a sort of like a buzz, but to me, I always think it sounds a bit more like the bird's like inhaling as it's ready to, go for the rest of the song. And hopefully someday you get to experience a Sora chorus like that. If you're in the right area, they can just be thick as thieves. You can have a whole pile of them going in, and they kind of start kicking one another off. One will start going, and that'll cause a chain reaction, and another will go, and another will go, and another will go. And as I mentioned before, if you're here on the prairies, we have a lot of roads that go by and through wetlands, and sometimes all it takes is you slamming your car door to get the Soras set off and going. So you know it's a really neat thing. So hopefully one day you get to go experience a whole bunch of Sora in one place, all kind of going nuts. You don't need to go at 4 a.m. It does help, but you can definitely a little bit later in the morning too. They're still going out. And again, nighttime's another one where Soras can be really, really quite active. I can't remember if this one had an animation along. Ooh, I think it does. Okay, let's listen to that one again. And this time I've got animations for the species. I don't have, all of the Sora, I don't think, showing up. But you'll get the gist of it. So quite an amazing cacophony. I'm just seeing quickly in the comments here. Do you think in 2025 you'd hear as many different calls? Oh yeah, it's while there have been bird declines, wetlands are really kind of a magnet for a lot of, species. So I I believe that that same wetland, if it still had the same amount of water, that's the thing that's changed is in the last 10 years we've gone from quite a wet situation on the prairies to right now it's quite a dry situation on the prairies. So that I think would have a bigger impact than anything at the moment. And maybe in another 5 or 10 years that we're going to be back to flood situation here. I know everybody's maybe shaking their heads in Manitoba right now because you guys you get a lot of water. You get a lot of Saskatchewan and Alberta's drainage, but you also just get far more rain than we do here. They're further away from the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, so they definitely get more precipitation. But yeah, I'm sure if I were to go back to that wetland and it would be similar water conditions, that you'd be hearing all of these birds going. Their wetlands are really, really incredible for attracting species like that. Okay, I've got a couple of other ones. This is just going back through some of the other videos that I've put together. So we'll just give another listen. And if you have any questions about, a call or anything in the chat, feel free to add it in. So here's some of those annotated soundscape videos that I'm gonna try to make a bit more in next year's MarshWatch off season. It's not the off season for my work, but it is the off season for the program. Okay. Ooh, don't know why my screen is flickering. Okay, I think we got one or two more here. Yeah, there was a mourning dove in the background. Good job, Edgar. So yeah, hopefully, you know, as you learn some of the bird songs in the wetland, I find it's a really good little area to learn your calls. You'll find that as you start to learn a few bird calls, it gets easier to learn more of them. You develop a bit more of an ear for it and a way of kind of making the songs make sense in your brain. So, it can seem overwhelming at first, especially the sound stuff because you're there, you can't hit pause. It's going all around you, and it is normal to feel overwhelmed by it, especially if you feel like you've been doing pretty good learning them and it's been going well up into a certain point. And I've mentioned this before, but I see this, every year when we're training new seasonal staff, you hit a bit of a plateau. You're doing great, learning, remembering, and then for whatever reason your brain just crashes and it starts to mix things up and you start to lose confidence and all of it becomes overwhelming. And the best thing you can do when that happens is just take a break. you know okay, okay, we're done trying to learn for the day. Come back at it. Sleep does really amazing things for the process of learning and remembering. So if you're getting to a point where it's just, ah, gosh, it's a lot, I really wish I knew these better, sleep on it. Come back, try again tomorrow, and just know that Even if you're just getting sounds from the unknown to the familiar, that you're making progress. So if you're like, hey, all of these wetland, they're all starting to sound familiar. Maybe I can't put a name to all of them yet, but all of those sounds are starting to be familiar. And that's when you can also, pick out something different. You're like, well, that is an unfamiliar song. And that's all part of the learning process. It doesn't all happen at once. So totally normal to hear all that sometimes and just get overwhelmed. And you know, this is true in a lot of places, but especially here on the prairies, because we have so many of those small wetlands. You're not just going to hear wetland species when you're out in a wet, and it could be a very big wetland, but there's going to be other species that are either wetland adjacent, or they just happen in lots of different habitats. Like mourning doves will nest in all kinds of different habitats. If there's shrubbery and some trees going on sometimes in a wetland, you will for sure have mourning doves in the wetland. And it's not because they're cluing into the wetland itself. They're there for other structural reasons. But wetlands are pretty incredible that way, in terms of there is sometimes, like, that core group of species, but all kinds of other things come to take benefit from it as well. Okay, if you want to take part in the checklisting part of MarshWatch, I would absolutely welcome that you do that. So you can, go to any wetland anytime. If you're familiar with important bird areas, those are areas that are really important to, get citizen science data from. So if you want a little bit of a mission, look up important bird areas, and a lot of those places, they even have caretakers you can get in touch with, but you can just go and collect information from those places. And those are super useful places to collect any sort of bird data from, or any data on plants as well if you're submitting it to iNaturalist. So you can register online for MarshWatch. You can do this through Nature Counts, get the app or the data sheet. The MarshWatch website has that data sheet, and there's that handy kind of tips and tricks sort of for some of the species on the back side of it. So you might just want to check that out anyway. But you know, I know some people, myself included, sometimes I just really like a piece of paper and I like to, get to ignore my phone for a while. But you can absolutely use the app. The apps are, they're getting much better. And the Nature Counts app, which is, Nature Counts is Birds Canada's data platform. It's getting better and better every year. Get out, observe any wetland that you like, any time of day, and identify and count birds and note the amphibians, noting that call chorus, and then go ahead and submit those observations and share them with us, and it'll get included in our citizen science data set. So if you want to go out and do that, I certainly welcome you to do so. And I promised some numbers. So 2025, this has been our best year yet. We had 348 people register, and we've had registrations going through the entire, as the webinar was going, like weekly, there was new registration. So I was kind of blown away by that. Um, the I was able to estimate the amount of viewers based on, some of you have been really good at answering that kind of post-webinar survey, like how many people were watching for you. Well, I take that average and I apply it to the people who didn't, respond to the survey, and that's totally fine. It's not, you don't have to respond to the survey, but that's how I got my estimate for the average number of viewers. I got, everyone who tuned in, everybody who said how many people were tuning in with them, and then I used that average to add a correction factor to people who didn't answer. So roughly the estimated viewership is 144 per session. The max was 219 and the lowest was 100. And usually as I'm I'm seeing like the participant numbers, like we've been above 80 for almost all of these. So it's pretty amazing to see just how many people are able to tune in live, because I know a lot of people can't make it on Wednesdays, and the recordings reflect that. Holy cannoli. So on the YouTube channels, the 2025 recordings have 465 and a half hours worth of view time. I don't go by, the amount of views, because, you can just click on a video, watch it for 3 seconds and move on to the next, and that still counts as a view. So I look at, how many hours are people, investing in watching the material? And it's amazing. That has kind of blown me away. And especially, even last year's suite of recordings, which have been up for an entire year at this point to date. The lifetime of those recordings was 365 hours worth of view time. So we're getting a lot more, views on the recordings. And I'm also amazed that the soundscapes from this year, there's been 1.5 hours of view time on those, and those are small snippets. So that means, they're getting a lot of repeats, and they're getting just a fair amount of views. So I'm just kind of blown away by how many people are tuning in, because when we first started this, we weren't really sure how a 10-week series was going to go. And our initial idea was like, these are going to be 15 minutes, they'll be quick, they'll be snappy. And as I started to develop the material, it was kind of clear that I didn't think a quick, snappy, 15 minutes cover 10 species was going to really work for people. And based on feedback over the years, and even stuff that you folks this year have sent me, it really seems like we're kind of doing a pretty good balance of spending time on the species, not over rushing it, really getting to know them. So it's working, and I'm so stoked about that. Um, we've had a lot of views in the States as well. So, we kind of, when we envisioned this, we just figured, largely Prairie Canada and maybe a bit of other Canada, but 15% of the viewership has been coming from the US, which is, I think that's kind of amazing. So thanks to our neighbors down south. This has more reach than kind of any of us ever anticipated. Of course, as you would expect, the bulk of the viewership comes from Canada. And I decided this afternoon that I was going to make ourselves a range map. We've looked at a lot of range maps over the course of this. So I figured for this year, I would highlight where people have tuned in from. So if your state, or I think we're only missing a couple of territories in PEI at this point, if you're not on that map, send me a note and I'll add it to my spreadsheet of many things where I keep track of this stuff. But as you would expect, the bulk of the viewership has come from Prairie Canada, 55% of it. But of course, there's viewership in BC, Ontario, Quebec, and it peters out towards the Maritimes, and especially so because it's a fair bit later for those folks. And again, we've got a good representation in the US as well. So that's just kind of amazing, I think, to see. A few people haven't responded to any of the surveys, so I haven't been able to figure out where you folks are, what province you're in. That's about 10% of the viewers in Canada and about 6% of those in the US, but just pretty blown away by kind of the reach of a program like this. So, and of course, the other announcement, just as a reminder, having to cancel all of the 2025 marsh walks, which is a bummer. I went skiing and have done a really thorough job of blowing my left knee, so I won't be walking in any wetlands anywhere, or driving very far for that matter. Anywho, sadly, no marsh walks for 2025. We're very likely to run this program, again next year. So hopefully I will be up and walking next year, and we can do some more marsh walks together, because that's always a ton of fun. I get to do a bit of a road trip, and I just get to meet people and go birding with them and try to see cool things. Last year we saw a green heron at Fort White in Winnipeg, and I hear that there was a yellow-crowned night heron spotted there recently. So sounds like Fort White alive. If you ever happen to visit Winnipeg, I highly recommend going there. They have all kinds of boardwalks through wetlands. It's a beautiful park. I don't think the entry fee is too expensive either. So anyway, if you're in Winnipeg or driving through Winnipeg, I would definitely check it out. It is a gorgeous little stop. Okay, I will be sending out a feedback survey probably in the next week or so, and I'm gonna ask for testimonials. You don't have to fill out the survey by any means, but if you do, it's super helpful on our end, especially if you'd like to leave a testimonial. As I've said before, I can tell people that this program's wonderful, but of course that's my job. I'm going to funders and things trying to say, I have this great program, fund me. It's really helpful if I can say, and look what all these people said. Isn't Aren't they saying nice things? Don't you want to fund us for another year? Anywho, so I will be sending out a feedback survey and soliciting some feedback. Again, all of that is totally, totally optional. I just want to give a shout out to everybody who helped make this program possible. It was developed by myself and Kyle Drake. It was kind of the brainchild. Kyle had been thinking about this for, probably 15 or 20 years at this point, and, finally had some time and some funding to actually make it happen. We had some great input from our colleagues, across Canada, the Doug Tozer, Amy Lee Kuhlenberg, Andrew Coughlin, and David Bradley. If you know Birds Canada, some of those names are going to be familiar to you. And I just want to give a special thanks to everybody whose photos that we've featured. There's a lot of photographers, especially local ones, that have just given me permission to, yep, go ahead, make use of any of my photos that you find on iNaturalist or eBird or whatever. So big thank you to them, and especially too for everybody who opts to share their photos on iNaturalist and put them under a Creative Commons license. There's various kinds of Creative Commons licenses, but for the most part, you're crediting the photographer. You're not making money off it, like, and we're not. I'm not. You. I was excited about the YouTube numbers, but trust me, they're nowhere near making like a buck off of them or anything. So anyway, we are a not-for-profit, so we're not, you know, sitting on a mountain of cash with these sort of projects. So anyway, just thank you to everyone who opts to share their photos on iNaturalist. It allows this kind of stuff to happen, because otherwise it would just be a lot of contacting hundreds of people. You've seen the slides. It's a lot of photos. So it is really nice when people share it with the intent that other people can use it in the spirit of free sharing and education sort of stuff. So anyway, special thanks to all the photographers. I am a terrible photographer. Well, I don't have a good camera, and I'm not out there stalking wildlife quietly. I'm usually out there counting and going quickly through places. So big thank you to everybody who takes lovely photos and allows people like me to use them. And thanks to you guys, the audience, for coming along with me on this little wetland journey. Maybe sometime next year we'll get to go on a walk together. But thank you guys so much. Without people tuning in, wouldn't be able to actually offer any of this programming. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Again, you can always get in touch with me. If you found that my email has I haven't gotten back to you in a couple of weeks, just send me another email. Sometimes things pile in, and if I click read and I don't respond right away, sometimes it can get buried. So I don't mean to ignore anyone. Feel free to email me, and feel free to re-email me. You can always reach out at llaftermoy@birdscanada.org. You can always visit the MarshWatch page. The videos are always going to live on YouTube, so long as, I guess, YouTube is allowed or is existing, and I can keep them up there for free. So on the MarshWatch webpage, there are links to the previous year's playlists. So eventually these will get relegated to one of those previous year's playlists, and you can always find them there. But there'll be a new suite for the new recordings that we make next year. You can follow Birds Canada all over the place. We're on lots of the socials. I don't know if we've made a post to Blue Sky yet. That's not my department, mercifully. But we're on all kinds of socials. Birds Canada is a national not-for-profit. We do, we don't generate a lot of funds, so we operate on donations and, of course, funding from supporters that you know give out funding and granting to not-for-profits like ours. Those specifically for MarshWatch have been the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, as well as Wildlife Habitat Canada. And if you like wetlands and you like stamps, maybe even if you don't like stamps, Wildlife Habitat Canada is the organization that runs the duck stamp in Canada. And you don't actually need to go duck hunting to get a stamp. You can just go to the post office, request a stamp. Can't remember what they're at now, $17, but the proceeds for that go to a lot of habitat programs and programming like this. So Wildlife Habitat Canada is funding programs like this through sales of the duck stamp. They're beautiful. They're ducks. Some of them are maybe they're not all waterfowl, but they're upland or wetland game birds, like some of the snipe. Anyway, they're gorgeous stamps, and it's a cool way to kind of contribute directly to habitat conservation and this type of programming. So stamps are cool. I used to collect them as a kid, so I like them. Anyway, that's my little soapbox. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll turn the recording off now and see you guys next year.